Welcome to the Mind Gut Conversation, your go-to podcast for exploring cutting-edge ideas in optimal health and the fascinating science of mind-gut microbiome interactions. I'm your host, Emma Maya. Here we bring together thought leaders, groundbreaking researchers, and innovative practitioners to share insights that can transform the way you understand your body, mind, and overall well-being. Whether you're a health enthusiast, a curious learner, or a professional in the field, this podcast is your gateway to unlocking the secrets of the mind-gut connection. So settle in, open your mind, and join us as we journey into the science and stories shaping the future of health. Today, I speak with Dr. Zain Kassam about the health benefits of probiotics, one of the most popular and fastest growing products in the field of dietary supplements. Dr. Kassam brings a lot of scientific, clinical, and marketing expertise to the field and is the Chief Medical Officer at Seed Health. Prior to his current role at Seed, he was the co-founder and Chief Medical Officer at two foundational microbiome therapeutics companies, OpenBiome and Finch Therapeutics. Welcome to the show, Zain. You are the CMO of Seed Health. And with Seed being a key player in the probiotic space, I was sort of curious, you've worked for other microbiome companies in the past. What made you choose Seed as your current workplace?
Well, first of all, delighted to be here, Emran. So excited to kind of share the conversation about the microbiome, where we are, where we're going, perhaps. So to answer your question, maybe take a step back. So, my career started as a gastroenterologist, and I saw the firsthand impact of applying the microbiome to human health. I have a patient kind of seared in my imagination, in fact. But those experiences, those clinical experiences, inspired me to go and get my clinical trial training at Harvard, did an MPH, and then I went off and did a postdoc in machine learning and AI applied to the microbiome at MIT. Very unusual for a medical doctor to do that way back in the day. And from there, I've spent the last decade building and scaling microbiome startups. First, actually, as co-founder and chief medical officer of OpenBiome. OpenBiome pioneered fecal transplants, and we treated nearly over 70,000 patients across 1,600 hospitals in a very quick span. And then I was a co-founder and chief medical officer of Finch Therapeutics, which took a precision microbiome approach, applying AI to help patients with inflammatory bowel disease, as well as individuals with C. diff as well. And I did a number of FDA kind of approved, FDA oversighted trials in the C. diff space. But now at Seed, it's a little bit of a different approach. And so kind of comparing and contrasting those things, I think the microbiome is very different than other sciences. It can be evaluated and explored in two ways, right? And the path that I took it previously was biological drugs, the pharmaceutical industry, and then there's the consumer health wellness industry. So let's evaluate those both in turn. So, on the pharmaceutical side, really a big focus on treatment. Pretty slow to impact humans, right? The clinical trial and approval process takes some time. When approved, I would say the pharmaceutical and biotech industry are not very strong communicators about the technology and helping to empower patients to adopt the medicine. But the science and the clinical trials are exceptional, right? They're the best in the world.
Yeah.
On the flip side, on the CPG and wellness side, there's a focus on prevention. Very fast to impact humans, right? Can get there very quickly. Very strong communicators and empowerers of health. But the science and the clinical trials leave a lot to be desired. And so to me, I think there's always been this need for this third path to delivering healthcare that takes the best of kind of both those worlds, both those paths, and applies that to the real world. And that's kind of where Seed comes in. And Seed's applying that third path, essentially.
Yeah, I love the way that you presented this. I mean, that this is exactly, I've worked for a large part of my career early on in IBS drug development. And so I've worked a lot with pharmaceutical companies. And unfortunately, it didn't really result, despite 10 years of intense efforts, into something that it really made a difference. There's still same number of IBS patients that are suffering. It hasn't, after hundreds of millions of investments. And yeah, and then now I have a foot in the wellness and sort of the non-pharmaceutical, and I've noticed the same shortcomings as you do. The lack of lack of real evidence as you would require for an FDA approval, um, very exuberant communication from influencers on the web. It's almost now, the number of followers counts more than your academic credentials
Hmm.
in terms of recommendations.
Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, let me continue with your last statement. So you picked seed, and so why do you think seed stands out amongst the
Yeah.
growing number of probiotic companies? And a couple of things, it's better marketing, better product, more evidence,
Mhm.
or all three of those?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think if you like zoom back up, I think what Seed's trying to do is to take a biotech approach for everyday health, right? I think we're combining some leading science with best in class communication to meet people where they are. And both of those ingredients are necessary. Each individual alone is not sufficient. It's pretty rare to have like a bioinformatics expert work with a communication guru. That happens at Seed. It's pretty magical to be part of. And so I think that's one of the key like elements of seed that distinguishes it amongst its peers. We develop really kind of scientifically distinct, clinically effective biotics that have a chance to really activate health transformation kind of from within. We're best known for our flagship project, DSO1, which is the number one selling probiotic in the US. And so kind of bridging those two things together, this science with communication, that's at the like kind of core to our thesis. But I think there's another element scientifically that's core to our thesis. And that's that not all probiotics are the same. Probiotics to me, Emran, is like saying the word medicine. Aspirin and Viagra, very different medicines, right? And similarly, I think there's very different biology and very different clinical impact for different probiotics. Yet most clinicians, even GI doctors, rarely know the differences between,
Yeah.
one or the other. One can be a fungi, one can be a bacteria. They're like different trees of life. Yet most clinicians don't know. So I have a lot of empathy for consumers when there's so much noise in the marketplace, right? There's so much noise from whether it's influencers or whether it's advertisements. It becomes really, really hard to unpack what's real and what's not real. But just like with medicines, you really need to know the differences between the different ones because some strains fight off and inhibit pathogens. Others have the genetic code to increase estrogen. Yet it's very difficult for consumers to know the differences. And I think seed does probiotics very differently.
Yeah, I mean, I personally feel, having spent a lot of my time in sort of hardcore science,
Mhm.
interacting with the leading neuroscientists on certain brain regions, and the microbiome is a different world. A lot of the research is big data driven, no longer hypothesis driven. You just, then you apply AI to your massive amounts of data. So it's just very different from what I have done for most of my life. And I think for a lot of patients, I mean, they're neither the traditional scientists nor
Yeah.
it's very difficult to understand that. The microbiome science and the probiotics, it's just a different category of things.
I think it's like it's actually much easier to understand in some ways. And I don't know, like CRISPR or CAR T therapy, right? All these like very technical sciences are hard to communicate, but people generally understand that we have, you know, good bacteria and bad bacteria, and you're often missing the good bacteria. And so the communication place and the entry to access the like education and the knowledge around the science becomes easier, but it doesn't replace the need for very rigorous science, right? We need to understand the biology. Are we hitting a butyrate pathway? Are we optimizing the barrier function? Are we decreasing the inflammatory cascade? No different than any other, um, you know, therapeutic approach. You have to understand the like nuts and bolts of the biology, not just the
Yeah,
communication piece. I think both together become really, really important. And you have to find people where they are, right? And I think it's
yeah,
always the challenge of, do you talk about, Cloudin and HDAC, or do you talk about like barrier function and inflammation, or do you talk about leaky gut, right? There's like very different levels of how to communicate, and you have to find the right like mix to the right person.
yeah,
Otherwise, you fail. And I think one of the really core theses is at Seed is that science is not complete until it's communicated. You have to communicate it. You have to share that. It's not just about impact factor, our journals that we publish in. It's about impact on people. And I think that's the thing that's like kind of near and dear to our hearts.
Yeah, no, this is also, I mean, I couldn't agree more with this. I mean, this is sort of what, what I've embarked on in my career at this point. Um, I personally feel I've published enough papers. I had a
Hmm.
big enough impact factor. Um, but what I realized is very few scientists consider the communication as an important part of their job, and it's even partly discouraged by the institutions. Is it right? You focus on your NIH grants, not on social media. I think it almost should become part of the training. This communication to the public, both well, mainly to the patients, but to the public in general, because I mean, there was a lot of criticism of science, and so I think if other people other than the scientists take over that important piece, it's problematic.
I
It's
think you're totally right. I think three quick reactions to that. The first of which I was takes me back to my training where I helped develop some medical education, teach the teacher. So like how to train residents to speak about science more effectively. That was one of the modules, and I think that's a really important piece of it on how to communicate really, really well. I think folks in the social media like yourself and other gastroenterologists, Austin Chang, are very strong in being able to kind of translate that. But at the end of the day, I don't think we get the necessary training clinically to be able to have those conversations. It's a combination of Aristotle used to say like ethos, pathos, and logos, right? Who's the messenger? Who's saying the information? What's the logic behind it? And we're very good at that. But what's the story that goes with that? And I think we have to have all three of those to appropriately communicate, but also kind of diagnose what level of information, technical information, storytelling, like who are we speaking to? And I think that's an area that you're very strong at, and I think having more of that has to be necessary in academia. Otherwise, we're going to lose the battle on communication
yeah,
with the broader population, right? We're going to have individuals that are internet experts sharing information that's murky, where we've been trained in understanding the facts, and we just have to add the like being able to communicate it properly. And that's why I think going back to like science is not complete until it's communicated is so important.
yeah, great point. So, yeah, let me say a few things about, and these statistics. I mean, the US probiotic, and I'm going to read this off here because I can't remember the numbers. US probiotic market is valued at 12.5 billion in 2023, expected to grow to close to 40 billion by 2033. Um, Worldwide, the probiotic market is estimated to be around $88 billion and growing at a rate of 14% from 2024 to 2030. What is the driving force behind this amazing growth?
I mean, I think you and I both know this. We've kind of entered gut mania, right? For lack of a better word. We've seen this like rise of health and wellness that's been propelled by mostly consumer enthusiasm for gut health, microbiome, probiotics, and really it's resulted in a category that's riddled with really misleading messaging and I would say questionable products and hyperbolic claims, right? Like this like mismatch of like fact and fiction to some degree. I think this has really been very much true in the probiotic category, which, as you know, the FDA classifies as a dietary supplement. It's regulated, but not really very well enforced, and very well, not a lot of clear oversight, and that's led to this like explosion. I think both the general social media and popular zeitgeist with this under regulated state in the probiotics has led to this consumerism and a lot of opportunism, which is definitely at an all-time high, and just a ton of noise, right? Like a ton of information, which is really hard to digest and to like navigate and like set apart. Even as microbiome experts, there are even just the academic side, there's like 2,000 microbiome publications a month. Yet, there's
Yeah, and if
probably
you and
double that in terms of the information we're receiving in just the general internet, right? So I think that's kind of been the key piece of this.
yeah, and if you looked at staying with the scientific publications, if
Yeah.
you just look at that, I mean, it's viewed by the public as science, but a lot of this is low quality science. There's a lot of these publications come up in very low impact journals. Then a lot of people like in the functional medicine community, I always,
Sure.
surprisingly, I get invited to many of these meetings. There just was one in New York at the annual meeting, and one thing I've realized that many It's a very popular specialty now in medicine, almost competing with the popularity of traditional medicine. And I think one technique that functional medicine practitioners use, they look at all the publications and they don't really say, okay, this is if something doesn't make it into one of the top journals, it's probably not reproducible or,
Yeah.
you know, and so that's created this tremendous amount of noise. It sort of drives you crazy uh, somebody has spent his most of his life in academia,
Yeah.
but unfortunately, that's the way it is. It's
I think we have to meet people where they are. And I think I'm actually reminded a little bit about my fecal transplant journey. In 2011, when I went to DDW, for those that don't know, Digestive Disease Week, one of the biggest GI medical meetings in the world, I think the biggest. And I presented my poster on fecal transplants. And I mean, I got laughed at like pretty hard, actually. People were kind of like snickering. It felt a little bit like Barry Marshall back in the day, right? Like people laughed at me pretty hard. And
yeah, yeah,
then, you fast forward 5, 6, 7 years later, now have done that research. It's been done rigorously, it's been done thoughtfully, and now it's in clinical guidelines, right?
yeah.
FMT fecal transplants are part of American journals and the AGA's clinical guidelines. And I feel a little bit of that like sentiment in probiotics, where I think before a lot of people threw out the baby with the bathwater, but if done in a rigorous way and done like thoughtfully, you can kind of end up in the same spot. Um, and I think there's an opportunity there for us. I think where there's like, I'll call it hidden value. I think that in my journey with fecal transplant, I also learned that not all clinicians have this require the same level of evidence to change practice. Some clinicians require, it to be in clinical guidelines. Some require, multiple double-blind placebo-controlled trials. Some require it, cohort studies are enough. Some even think are quite early adopters that, if we have consent and there's no safety issue, a handful of case series is okay. And I think it just depends on both the clinician, the patient, and the body of evidence on where that adoption practice curve is. Of course, over time, we should always get more and more rigorous information and better quality data. But in very serious conditions, I think the level of evidence has always been lower, as we know, over time, as long as the safety profile is there. And I think that's what I also see somewhat happening here is where we just have to meet people where they are.
Yeah, I mean, looking into the future, I mean, like people talk about second and third generation probiotics and bioengineered probiotics or microbes for treatment of specific diseases. I mean, this is clearly on the horizon, and I've had interactions with companies that work in this, and scientists that work on this bioengineering. I'm basically just using the shell of the microbe as a vehicle, as a putting a load, a cargo into this vehicle, and then so this is definitely, I mean, I would say several years away from us today with the safety and probably a lot of concerns about the public, anything bioengineered getting into your body. And so we're not quite there yet. But I think if you look at where we are today, you have to look at criteria that are not yet capable or recommendable for specific diseases. I think it's more this general gut wellness or reestablishing balance in the microbial ecosystem.
Mhm.
Do you agree with this? I mean, we're not.
I think yes and no. I think we can go beyond just an overall like simplification. So I'll give you a very specific example. So I think there are many benefits with DS1, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But if we take a bit of a step back and talk about something that's very appealing for general wellness, let's talk about longevity. It's like broad term that's categorized very broadly, right? And so let me walk you through some thinking about a couple studies. So really elegant study done out of Seattle, published in Nature Metabolism, I think this past year. Sean Gibson, one of my colleagues at MIT, was on the group. And it was a 9,000 person cohort between 18 and 101. And they looked at the microbiome over the health span. Kind of two lessons from that study. Number one, microbiome diversity was highly associated with a healthy lifespan. And number two, individuals, or they called uniqueness, but in number two, the other element that was kind of surprising, individuals that did not have a healthy lifespan were depleted in butyrate producing organisms.
Mm,
And that was really interesting to
mhm,
me. And I
mhm.
think probably no surprise to you. But, that's an epidemiology study. Chicken or the egg, we don't really know. So, when you look at the totality of evidence, you can go into mouse models. And so a really nice study that was done out of China, which looked at young mouse stool and old mouse stool, so young and old mice, and they transplanted them. And when you transplant the old mouse stool into the young mouse, three things happened: increase in neuroinflammation, overactivation of microglia, kind of associated with neurodegenerative conditions. Two, increase in the inflammatory cascade in the retina, age-related retinal changes, C3, for example. And then number three, barrier disruption in the gut and increasing inflammation. All pretty interesting to me as an endpoint that matter clinically. But why does it work? I'm still not there yet. Why does it work? Another study done out of the Karolinska Institute and paired with Sweden looked at that specifically in the same type of a model with mice, and they saw that it was butyrate, and butyrate specifically interacting with a set of longevity pathways that are relatively well established. So, for example, fibroblast growth factor 21, and decrease in mTOR and increase in AMPK. So technical stuff for the audience, but generally speaking, pathways that help autophagy, helping to clear out old and dead cells for increased turnover. To me, that goes back to the biology then, is saying, gosh, well, butyrate's really important. That's a very specific pathway, and we're really excited that DS01 increases butyrate, right? So that's something where you can go from something that's epidemiology data to the science that's really pathway specific, to getting to the biology of a consumer health product to hit a specific pathway. And I think that's really exciting, kind of seeing that genesis.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, because you've talked about that, both of these studies, found butyrate as a key player. I mean, it sounds overly simplistic, particularly as a scientist, you always want to stay away from these simple explanations, like the string theory of the microbiome. But it seems at the moment, a lot of evidence is converging in that direction. And I'm sure there's other molecules. But in terms of the beneficial molecules generated by the microbiome, the butyrate right now is definitely stands out. I always think about it, the balance between the potentially harmful substances that are, or metabolites, like, like canurinin, which could facilitate neurodegeneration, and inflammatory mediators like fragments of the microbes, interacting with toll-like receptors. It's the balance between the butyrate, this endogenously produced anti-inflammatory molecule, with these potentially harmful. So that right now is kind of I would say, the simplest explanation why there's benefits from the regular probiotics. Not so you don't need the fancy ones that do one particular thing. It's yeah, this is interesting in a field that's so complicated, and with so much research going on, publications growing exponentially. There's a relatively simple explanation, has emerged that, like everything in science, will at some point be proved or rejected. But I think for right now, I think a synbiotic, like, the seed synbiotic is definitely building on that current, on this current knowledge. And this is something we couldn't really say 5 years ago. I mean, this has definitely changed. I mean, all these things that you can see, for example, in mouse models. I've worked with mice for a long time and rats earlier. But I've become very, as a clinician, I've become very skeptical. And there's this huge translational gap from almost anything that you can show in a mouse to very few things that translate. But this one is. I mean, the short chain fatty acid, butyrate, anti-inflammatory concept, I think, is definitely one that you can take from the cells to the mouse model and to human studies and epidemiological studies.
I think it's an interesting one. I think it's as a pioneer in the fecal transplant space, we looked at butyrate a lot, and the data there for whether it's in FMT studies and ulcerative colitis or others. I think that's kind of borne out pretty well for the most part, on being a key driving metabolite. Will there be more and more information coming from the microbiome? Absolutely. But I think we started with fecal transplants and just thinking about bile acids or just colonization resistance, or just, one or two things, but I think we know that we have to think about systems biology here. We're dealing with a very different approach. We're not looking for like necessarily a single molecule with a single hit. It's multimodal. And
Yeah.
that's actually the beauty of this, is that there's going to be multiple modalities of action here, in a safe way that's kind of fine-tuned because we've evolutionary evolved with microbes, at least beneficial microbes, to ensure benefit. And so, of course, there's more complexity, but I think, for the most part, I think we both agree that that butyrate pathway is one that's pretty darn interesting.
Yeah, and there's this one thing, I mean, I always like these evolutionary concepts around the microbiome. It's the oldest life form, 3.5 billion years,
Mhm.
tremendous amount of experience and, what some people call implicit intelligence, not explicit. They can't express it in words, but they exchange it with our gut, with our body, silently. That there's no communication that you could pick up or conversation. Um, I find that fascinating, and it must have turned out to be so beneficial for every animal, any animal life form on the planet, that that arrangements stayed, over
Yeah.
hundreds of millions of years. So it's got to be, and maybe it's something as simple as this butyrate production being an endogenous healing principle, that animals take advantage of. I mean, there's many other things like vitamins and
Totally. I think for me, I'm always like struck by the power of the microbiome. And I know you obviously are an expert in this space and your audience is relatively well known, but like nearly 100 trillion microbes that live in and on us. That's like more stars in the Milky Way galaxy from a biology impact perspective. And yet, when I was at Harvard and MIT and people were like, I don't know, studying to train monkeys to control robots, I was really focused on understanding that the importance of this like very invisible organ. And it's not just a bystander, right? Like actually an active organ that helps us digest. It modulates our immune system. It releases molecules that impact our mood, our metabolism, even longevity potentially, right? Yet we have previously for decades really thought about microbes as the bad guys. We've had this like, this thinking that it's just something that causes disease. And we've taken this like atomic bomb approach, right? 200 million doses of antibiotics a year, ultra sterile environments, ultra processed foods. And yet we really need not an atomic bomb, we needed a scalpel, right? And because the consequence has been killing off many of the beneficial microbes that are now linked with increase in autoimmune disease, increase in allergic disease, increase in metabolic diseases. Maybe not that's the only thing, but it's a key driver. I think the science is clear epidemiologically to see this rise that we're kind of experiencing in a modern age. So I'm with you. I'm always fascinated to go back to like first principles of like the microbiome itself. It's always puts me in awe.
This episode is brought to you by Seed. I've spent years studying gut health, and one thing is clear: your gut does more than just digest food. It plays a critical role in nutrient absorption, metabolism, immune function, and overall well being. While a diverse diet rich in fiber and fermented foods is ideal, modern lifestyles can make it difficult to consistently nourish our microbiome the way we should. That's where Seed's DS-01 daily symbiotic comes in. I've always been skeptical of probiotics, due in part to the fact that most don't survive the harsh journey through the stomach and intestine. But DS-01 is different. It's a two-in-one probiotic and prebiotic formulated with 24 clinically studied strains and delivered through Seed's capsule-in-capsule technology to ensure beneficial bacteria actually reach the colon. Unlike many probiotics on the market, DS-01 is backed by real science. It has undergone rigorous clinical research to support gut barrier integrity, microbiome diversity, and digestive health. For me, gut health is a long-term investment, not a quick fix. It starts with diet, mindfulness, and lifestyle. But if you're considering a symbiotic, I always recommend choosing one that's been scientifically validated, like DS-01. If you'd like to try it, Seed is offering 25% off your first month with the code Meyer25. As always, I encourage you to do your own research and find what works best for you. Yeah, I want to come back in the second half of our conversation to, the seed symbiotics, ask a few specific questions, but um, One last general question. So it's about this catchword gut health. And I think influencers have played a big role. I think, I've played a minor role in this with the publication of the Mind Gut Connection book, which initially in the first year was not very popular, but then, became an Amazon bestseller. And there's a lot of activity on social media and now a lot of books but there's really no scientific definition or hard science supporting this term. So in my first 2 decades as a gastroenterologist, and I'm sure you went through the same thing, we were considered the medical experts for gut diseases. Gut health was basically the absence of disease. There was no, expression that we would use. We're striving for optimal gut health. We want to get rid of IBD and celiac and peptic ulcer disease at the time. So what has changed? I mean, what has this is a revolution that's almost happened within, I would say, started maybe the earliest forms 7 years ago, and has really accelerated, has become and it's been adopted, like at UCLA, for example, we have this digestive wellness center now, which was unthinkable, like 10 years ago. And it's all about gut health. So what do you think has changed? What has brought this major shift?
I think the social media and the broader media have unlocked people to feel much more comfort in sharing their bowel habits generally and their digestive issues more broadly. I think that, it's hard to know if you have, if you have very serious gastrointestinal medical diseases, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, even IBS to a degree, those come up they come up frequently for us, obviously, but there's this set of individuals that have, I'll call like subclinical symptoms. They're
Mhm.
just bothered and like have some bloating, they have irregularity. It doesn't meet the criteria of, the diseases that we've talked about, but something's off.
Mhm.
And you are just hyper aware to it, but it doesn't feel warranted to go talk to your doctor about it,
Mhm.
right? It just feels off, but not enough. And some days you feel better than others. So you can kind of get back to that good zone. But there's a lot of an absence of words to kind of really describe it. And when people start to optimize some of the lifestyle things, whether it's diet and other factors, they feel better in their gut directly. And so this has like helped facilitate the believability of all the like social stuff, right? Like, and the media stuff. That's allowed us to say, hey, other people are suffering. I'm not alone.
Mhm.
And maybe it's not a peptic ulcer disease, but something's a little bit off for here. And that I think has kind of helped unlock, the interest to optimize, your GI system in a whole. And I think we should take that as an advantage as gastroenterologists to have those conversations beyond just the scope of, very technical medical diseases, but intervention preventative care, right? Like colonoscopies early, for example, or appropriately, right? Within guidelines. Can we optimize your diet in the right context? Is there a role for supplementation in the right context? And so I think this is the thing that's helped unlock that. So I view that as, it could be viewed as a negative. I try to like jujitsu it and make it a positive as an opportunity to have a conversation.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, people that had these non-specific or not subclinical symptoms, they didn't have anybody to talk to because it's not a topic that you would bring up in a dinner party conversation. You wouldn't talk about bloating and abdominal distension and gas. Now you can.
Yeah.
I've been to a recent fairly high level, event like this, and for a long period of time, people came up with their symptoms. I have this. What should I do with this? In a dinner situation, and the same thing with the physicians. The problem with the physicians is a lot of them don't really have good answers for this. We're not trained, and so there's not this whole other like functional medicine practitioners, particularly, that really are good in this, giving a holistic explanation. May not be correct scientifically, but at least the patient gets an explanation, what they have and why they have the symptoms. And I think a product, like the Zeed synbiotic has benefited tremendously from this trend. I mean, like, if you had this, if you tried to market it 20 years ago, it would be very difficult. It would be a small subset of people say, "Oh, I eat my yogurt. I don't need anything else."
No, I think you're totally right. And I think you're thinking about the dinner table conversation, gosh, as GI doctors, everyone's telling me about their poop all the time, whether I ask about it or not, right? I'm mostly not. Like, oh, I'm a Bristol 6. I'm like, how do you know about the Bristol stool scale? So, oh, I know a lot about stool, right? So I think there's this comfort level over dinner or otherwise that's definitely pervasive. I think the gut mania has kind of unlocked that for sure.
So, as you probably know, I've been promoting in our newsletter and social media diet and lifestyle modifications to my patients and also in my books. And I imagine most people buying the Seed Symbiotic are aware of these recommendations, and some may already have implemented them in their daily life. I would always be curious how many people, what percentage is actually implementing those things. I mean, is it just the bi-coastal areas, the young people, obviously, you know, West LA and in Manhattan, everybody is an expert on this. But there's millions of other people who may have heard about it, but say, I'm going to continue to eat my, traditional diet that I've grown up in, and it's been. Is there any evidence that the seed symbiotic provides a health benefit over and above these? So for those people that actually have made
Mhm.
these lifestyle changes, let's say
Yeah.
it's the minority, but is there a benefit over and above that lifestyle taking a symbiotic?
So let's start by saying, first of all, I'm a big believer in lifestyle changes, right? Like that is not, it's not a replacement. I'm a big believer in a diverse diet rich with fibers and fermented foods. The data is very clear about that, right? That said, I'm also a pragmatist. I know that most people don't eat a perfect, perfectly, don't have a perfect lifestyle. I certainly don't. And that's where maybe dietary supplements can be helpful. Um, Kind of, the way that I talk to, patients and clinicians and others about it is like kind of like an insurance policy, right? There's like these two pieces. There's like for the everyday health folks, it's kind of an insurance policy. It's similar to multivitamins. I remember asking 10 of my physician colleagues, hey, do you take a multivitamin? Like, where the evidence is there. I don't have to tell you, they're all excellent in the academic centers. They're like, yeah, I do. 8 out of 10 of them said yes, right? And they're like, I'm like, why? They're like, it's an insurance policy, Zain. I'm like, I would say that dietary supplements are an insurance policy because it's the 80-20 principle of life, right? Like most of the benefits coming from 20%, and I don't live a perfect lifestyle. And so that's kind of one element. There's also a second element, importantly, and Renee will know this, is that individuals that have very specific situations, right? So, for example, post antibiotics. Very common problem. Speaking of dinner table conversations, it's when I get at the dinner table literally all the time. Hey, Zain, I just had some antibiotics. What probiotics should take? I'm like, oh, that's a very complicated conversation, right? And there's been a lot of controversy around this, quite
Yep,
frankly.
yeah,
There's a Cell paper from, a few years ago that said, probiotics don't work. Doing nothing is better than doing probiotics. And back to my initial thesis, well, probiotics is saying the word medicine. One probiotic didn't work doesn't mean all probiotics didn't work. Do they have all the necessary tools for it to work? I don't think it did. So C did a clinical trial in individuals that were taking antibiotics. We presented this data at DDW, that big medical GI meeting that we talked about. Double-blind, placebo-controlled trial where we randomized individuals to get broad-spectrum antibiotics, Cipro and Flagyl, for 7 days, and DS-01, the daily symbiotic, during that time period and after, versus the broad spectrum antibiotics in a placebo and then a placebo after. And we looked very specifically across a couple things, but three really important lessons, Emran. So number one, first of all, it did increase the beneficial microbes about 175-fold. Two, it increased the diversity, which is also a beneficial surrogate for the microbiome. But the third one's the most important to me. Because not just the bugs, but what they do. We know that antibiotics have a significant impact on the barrier function, and which we saw. But what's really exciting to see was that for the first time, based on the gold standard biomarker, a lactulose-based test, we saw an improvement in the barrier function in the DS-01 arm compared to placebo, about 50%. And that was pretty striking for us, considering a recent systematic review and meta-analysis about 8 trials and 500 participants showed that no other probiotic was able to increase the barrier function with the gold standard biomarker like that. So that was really exciting for us and gives you an example of, where I think in specific situations about optimizing your microbiome in the context of, known disruptions. I also think there's some interesting thesis around potentially after a bowel prep, right? We know that we disrupt the microbiome post-bowel prep, and controversially how long that lasts for, but certainly studies have shown that up to many, many weeks after. So there may be an opportunity post-bowel prep when you're having insults to your microbiome, specific scenarios, to do that in an evidence-based way.
So you mentioned two examples. What other specific situations for not just for wellness, but for a restoration of homeostasis, let's put it in most general
Sure,
way.
sure. So I think we don't claim to make treatment claims about diseases, but in terms of just like talking about from a clinician to clinician perspective, talking about the literature, Dr. Tony Lembo, who we both know, Anthony Lembo, who was previously at Harvard and now at Cleveland Clinic, one of the world leaders in irritable bowel syndrome. He did a really elegant study with us at Harvard when he was there in irritable bowel syndrome. It was a 103-person double-blind placebo-controlled trial that we presented at DDW this past year as well, and showed some kind of three pretty remarkable things. It was DSO1 versus placebo. Number one, we saw a significant improvement in abdominal pain and constipation, which was fantastic to see. A number needed to treat of about 5, which, as you and I know, is like pretty meaningful. We saw an improvement in the microbiome, which was our main endpoint, and we actually learned the why. Or what we believed was the why, is that we saw an increase in serotonin, which is a driver of motility. And that was really interesting. From a population perspective, that was really interesting, is that it was an IBS-M and IBS-C. And we don't have a lot of tools in our tool belt for IBS-M. We have tools in our tool belt for IBS-C and IBS-D, so constipation predominant and diarrhea predominant. But IBS-M is kind of a weird and wonderful condition that we just kind of flip our therapies around, right? And so I think not to make claims about that, but we found that as a very interesting place to see some of the data.
Yeah, let's stick with the unique features of the seed symbiotic. Does the seed product recapitulate the benefits of a diet rich in different types of fiber and a variety of naturally fermented foods? Or
Yes.
is this just like a totally separate?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, I think for us, always a big believer in a diverse set of healthy foods, not a replacement. I'm a big believer in that. For example, fiber, I'm a big believer in fibers that optimize butyrate specifically. So I like inulin, things like Jerusalem, artichokes, and leeks and onions actually have the inulin that increase. I like pectin for apples, kind of whole foods. Apples increase pectin that increase butyrate producing organisms. In fact, whole wheats and rye, for example, also increase. So thinking about it from a biologically thoughtful way, it's number one. I also think fermented foods are really important. There's a nice study out of Stanford that just talked about diversity of fermented foods
Yeah.
being very beneficial. And I think that's really, really important. I also think it's really important to avoid ultra-processed foods. Lots and lots of data talking about emulsifiers, stabilizers, additives, and colorants, quite frankly, are unnatural colorants. And they increase the inflammatory cascade, they worsen the barrier function, they decrease microbiome diversity, which we know is a great metric. And so I don't think this is a replacement. People can and should have a healthy lifestyle. But again, as I said, I'm a pragmatist. So, 80/20, I like to have an insurance policy, and I know many of my colleagues do as well.
If I were a consumer looking for a probiotic, and this is the question I get almost after every single one of my talks,
Yeah.
no matter who the audience is, how sophisticated, what the topic of my talk is, it's always the same question. Which criteria, as a consumer, can I use to pick one amongst the hundreds of brands available and being promoted on the internet?
Yeah, I have deep empathy. I was like, information overload. There is so many. Like, just tell me what I can like grab onto and just like tell me the answer, right? So let me tell you a framework. I'm a big believer in like enabling people to have the right framework to make a decision, and then I can tell you why I think DSO1 fits into that. So I use the 4D approach. 4Ds. So the first D is diversity. So just like in a forest, having many, many diversity of trees is a good thing. In your gut, it's the same thing. Diversity is generally associated with optimal health, and the more diverse your healthy, beneficial microbes are, the better off it is. Yet you and I know most probiotics are one strain or two strains, right? They're very limited or a handful of strains. DSO1 is different. It has 24 strains. It's a broad spectrum probiotic that includes about 35,000 unique bacterial genes. It's trying to give that all-in-one probiotic approach. And that diversity is really, really important. So first D, diversity. Second D, delivery. Just like in a forest, if the sunshine doesn't get to the trees, it doesn't work, it doesn't grow, it doesn't thrive. You need to make sure that the sunlight gets there. Yet most probiotics, they die in the stomach. The acids there, they just die in the stomach because they don't get where they need to go. DS-01 is different. It is a targeted delivery capsule. ViaCap is our proprietary technology that allows the capsule and those microbes, those healthy beneficial microbes, to get to the right part of the intestine to essentially have its beneficial impact. So number two, delivery. Number three, third D is do-gooders. So just like in a forest, you want to have fertile soil, right? No food, plants don't grow, trees don't grow. Yeah, most probiotics don't include a prebiotic, the food that the microbes eat. And together, a probiotic and a prebiotic became a symbiotic. And that's what's different about DS-01. We are a symbiotic. DS-01 also includes a potent polyphenol prebiotic that optimizes the growth of the strains of DS-01. So that's number three, do-gooders. And the last one, Amrin, the fourth D, is the most important D, and that's data. Most probiotic companies, most consumer health companies say they're science-backed, but you and I know that it's not the same thing having data shown in a petri dish versus a clinical trial, and not all clinical trials are all created equal, right? So, we're a big believer in taking a very thoughtful approach to our development, not only the selection, in a biotech approach of how we put things together and the principles that I just articulated, but also to kind of then do the clinical trials that are necessary to change hearts and minds. And we talked a little bit about that. So diversity, delivery, do-gooders, those prebiotics, and data. That's the 4D approach. And we believe that DS-01 kind of checks all those 4 boxes.
Yeah, you certainly convinced me with these criteria, and I hope many of the listeners will be thankful for this kind of answer to the most ubiquitous question that comes up. Yeah, I think I sort of covered most of the points that I want to address. Let me ask one more thing here. So CPUs or the number of active microbes being present in a probiotic or symbiotic, different companies compete with higher and higher numbers, billions and hundreds of billions. Is that really a physiological way to deal with our microbial ecosystem? Obviously, we have trillions of microbes in there already. Is it necessary or actually beneficial to throw in something that doesn't really pay too much attention to what's already there, but that has a significant quantitative impact?
Yeah, it's a really important question that people often get confused a little bit about because, well, is more better? Well, we have to understand why more is being put in, partly because it's getting killed in the stomach, right? And so people want to put more in so they can get more eventually to get where it needs to go. But as I articulated with that, that second D's, if you're delivering the bacteria where it needs to go, you don't need to overwhelm. And in fact, if you overwhelm, you can get things like SIBO if it's in the wrong spot, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, depending on the context. So you really want to get it to where it is at the right dose. But let's take a step back before that, even just to remind everyone about CFU. So CFU stands for colony forming units, for those that don't know. This is a way that scientists typically determine, how many bacteria are there. They usually classically use a plate, right? And they use that back in the 1800s to count the number of cells, and it's a manual process. But because it's manual, it can vary quite a lot as well, up to 50%. At Seed, we actually don't use CFUs. We use another unit called AFUs, active fluorescent units, because we use a better technique, a gold standard technique for measuring and ensuring you have viable cells called flow cytometry. And that's kind of the gold standard way of evaluating it. It's what we've done in the therapeutic and biopharmaceutical industry to make sure that the live cells are effectively there. And so that's kind of what we use. Not a really easy way to compare head-to-head AFU versus CFU, but we believe that AFU is the better approach for measuring cells versus a more manual approach with big, wide variance. But at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter because the most important thing is that the cells are going where they need to go.
Yeah, the last question I've written down, I think you already answered it. So it was, what are the 3 major reasons why people would buy the seed symbiotic and not one of the many others that are, recommended by guidelines and promoted in all kinds of situations. I mean, maybe you want to repeat what you said, or maybe you want to add additional information.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more context. I kind of told you why I think it's the right tool, but I'll maybe give you the different lens on like what members and what people that are why people are taking seed, and at least when they what they report. And I think they do that for kind of three reasons. First, kind of promoting healthy regularity and stool quality. That's like a really important one that people are just feel better. It's kind of like we don't have a counterfactual, right? We don't know how our lived experiences in another context unless you try something. And what we're realizing is people take it and realize, oh man, I'm actually feeling better. I didn't think I had a problem, but I'm feeling better from a regularity perspective. So that's kind of like the one of the big reasons why people typically take a DSO1. The second is support ease of bloating. Bloating is really, really tricky. In fact, my very skeptical ophthalmology brother had a ton of bloating. And as a GI doctor, we know there's our pathway to trying to kind of help that. Nothing seemed to work for him. And he very skeptically said, okay, fine, I'll try it, Zain. You've been talking about this for a while. Let me try DSO1. He tried it for about 12 weeks and he sheepishly came back to me afterwards and said, all right, it works. It worked for me at least. And so I was really like encouraging to see. So bloating is another. And then another is kind of related to folks that are really into understanding the biology. And so gut immune function, we talked about butyrate a little bit and CRP, and those are having occasional GI and environmental stressors as well. And so those are the reasons why the members kind of tend to go towards DSO1, which you can find in Target nationwide on seed.com, as well as Amazon and FullScript, one of our physician channels. But those are the reasons that people are stay on it. And when you talk about marketing, I'm reminded of a story that a major brand in the GI space is telling me. He's like, Zain, you don't need to do advertisements when things work. People stay on it when it works. And I think that's been one of our tried and true kind of philosophies, and why I think we've been really successful. It's the #1 probiotic in the US. It's because it works. People stay on it because it's effective. And so I think that's been really, really kind of powerful.
Okay, well, I can only thank you, Zain, for spending an hour with me and going through all these various questions and topics. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope our listeners do as well. So, our podcast was with Zain Kassam, the Chief Medical Officer of Seed, the producer of DS01 Synbiotic. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.